The casino was alive with the scent of synthetic cigars and stolen fortunes. Beyond the velvet drapes and flickering neon glyphs, the underbelly of the Orion Syndicate pulsed like a severed vein still trying to beat. 100 species huddled under gilded chandeliers, exchanging whispered deals and wary glances. It wasn't just a casino, it was an empire's heartbeat, and tonight it skipped. Because something impossible had just happened. A human had walked in. The doors hadn't been blown off their hinges. No alarms had screamed their panicked warnings. No enforcers had drawn their plasma casters, though their hands hovered close. And yet, the moment he stepped inside, the entire room shifted. The air turned razor-thin. Conversations faltered. Even the dealers, mechanical and programmed for indifference, seemed to hesitate mid-shuffle. The Orion Mafia controlled every racket in 3 quadrants, their reach stretching from smuggler dens in the Zenth Belt to the black market auctions of Proxima. Prime, they didn't just run the underworld. They were the underworld. And humans were fodder. Small-time hustlers, mercenaries at best, corpses at worst. No human had ever walked into an Orion stronghold and lived to tell the story, until now. He was tall, but not unnaturally so. Dressed in something that didn't belong. A simple black coat, unmarred by insignia or house crest. He didn't posture, didn't strut. He moved, like someone who had already seen the ending of this play and wasn't worried about the act. He stepped up to the high-stakes table where the Vorak twins, 2 reptilian nightmares with obsidian scales, had been dealing a game older than the Syndicate itself. The chips in their taloned fingers froze mid-air, their slitted eyes narrowed. He smiled, not the cocky grin of a dead man who didn't know it yet, not the nervous smirk of a fool trying to buy time. A better offer was coming, and somehow, before he had even spoken a word, every criminal in that room already knew they would take it, because they were afraid not to. The Vorak twins didn't move. Their talons remained poised over the gaming table, black chips resting between their clawed fingers, like the weight of a decision yet to be made. Their slitted eyes traced the man standing before them, calculating, dissecting, deciding. The silence thickened. The high-stakes room, once a symphony of hushed deals and the rhythmic hum of energy fields, now felt like a tomb awaiting its first body. Every set of eyes in the casino had fixed on the newcomer, but none dared to act first, because no one understood how he had gotten here in the first place. The Orion Syndicate didn't have doors one could simply walk through. Their operations were a labyrinth of coded permissions, armed checkpoints, and blood-bound agreements stretching back centuries. Anyone who breathed the Syndicate's air had either earned the right to or paid the price for it. But this human, he wasn't on their books, wasn't a known smuggler, bounty hunter, or diplomat working under some fragile galactic immunity. He had no Syndicate-issued insignia on his lapel, no marks of an affiliated clan on his hands. He wasn't a desperate gambler looking for a seat at the table, nor a courier with a half-hearted plea for protection. He was unknown, and that made him dangerous. A few meters away, beneath the neon glow of shifting holographic advertisements, Gerulth Velos, the Orion Syndicate's Veilkeeper, watched from the shadows. His gossamer robes barely stirred as he shifted his weight, exuding an almost inhuman stillness. To outsiders, Gerulth was merely a spectre, a myth whispered between mercenaries and contract killers. But to those who thrived in the underworld, he was something far worse. The last voice you ever heard before, disappearing from every ledger, every memory, every timeline. And tonight, for the first time in decades, he was intrigued. The Vorak twins exchanged glances, a brief and silent conversation unfolding between them. Then one of them, Roktar, the eldest by a single molted cycle, spoke. His voice slithered out, a guttural mix of amusement and suspicion. "You shouldn't be here, human." The newcomer smiled again, Not a grin, not a smirk, just a shift of expression, precise and intentional. The kind of movement that made people doubt their own instincts, questioning whether they had already lost. A game they didn't even realize they were playing. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the edge of the gaming table. "I think," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a vibroblade through flesh, "that you're going to want to hear what I have to say." The Vorak twins flinched, not from the words, but from something else. Karulth narrowed his gaze, sensing it now too. It wasn't bravado, it wasn't arrogance, it was certainty, and certainty in this place was the deadliest thing a man could wear. The Vorak twins didn't blink. The air in the casino's high-stakes chamber had curdled into something dense and unbreathable, like the moment before a storm breaks. The neon glyphs overhead flickered in rhythmic pulses, their reflections dancing across the polished onyx table. But no one paid them any attention. All eyes were on the human, and the certainty in his voice. A human should not have spoken with such confidence in a den of predators. Not here, not in front of the Syndicate's most ruthless enforcers, yet he did. "Talk," Rokthar rumbled, his scaled fingers tightening on the game chips, his knuckles clicking. "Or die standing." The human's fingers drummed lightly against the table's surface, not nervously, deliberately. He let the silence stretch for a fraction too long, a subtle psychological knife twisted between the ribs of anticipation. Then he spoke. "The Syndicate is bleeding. A dangerous claim, one that should have had weapons drawn, but no one moved, because deep down every crime lord, smuggler, and enforcer in this room had felt it. The Orion Syndicate was vast, entrenched in every layer of the Galactic Underworld, but its grip wasn't as ironclad as it once was. Whispers of lost shipments, vanishing assets, rival factions making moves they should not have dared. Someone, or something, was challenging the Syndicate. And worse, they were winning. Karulth Velos, still watching from his shadowed perch, exhaled slowly. He didn't like how this human spoke, not because the words were dangerous, but because they were true. The human pressed on. "The Crimson Cartel took control of the Trello smugglers' wrote last cycle. You know this, but you don't know how they did it." A flicker of movement, a twitch in one of Rokthar's lower eyelids. A detail no one should have noticed. The human did. He leaned in slightly, voice smooth, effortless. "They didn't buy their way in. They didn't outgun your men. They outmaneuvered you, and now the same thing is happening in the Varkos Nebula. Your shipments are disappearing, not because of war, not because of rival clans." Another pause. "Because someone is playing a different game than you." Click. The Vorak twins' claws dug into the table. A silent, involuntary reaction. The only tell the human needed. He was right. Karulth Velos shifted at last, stepping forward into the dim crimson glow of the Syndicate's domain. His voice was a whisper that somehow carried across the room. "And what do you claim to know of this game?" The human turned. To him now. Everything. Another beat of silence. And then, "And I know how to win it." Tension fractured through the air, rippling outward. Somewhere in the casino, an energy pistol was unclipped from a holster, not fired. Not yet. But the intent was clear. A human had just stepped into the Orion Syndicate's house. And now he wasn't just talking. He was making a move. The silence cracked like a loaded chamber. Every crime lord, smuggler, and enforcer in the room was caught in the gravitational pull of the moment, staring, waiting, calculating. The Vorak twins held their silence, but their bodies coiled, muscles tightening beneath their obsidian scales. Predators deciding whether to strike. Karulth Velos was not a predator. He was something far worse, a strategist. His expression did not change, but the atmosphere around him shifted. The room itself seemed to shrink, walls closing in, shadows stretching deeper. His presence wasn't just seen, it was felt, and yet the human didn't flinch. His words had done what no one in the Syndicate had dared to do for cycles, spoken the truth aloud. And now the stakes had changed. Karulth stepped forward. The Vorak twins stiffened as the Veilkeeper passed them, but neither moved to stop him. His layered robes whispered against the air as he stopped a mere breath away from the human. "You say the Syndicate is bleeding," he murmured, voice like silk pulled over a blade, "and yet here you stand unscathed." The human met his gaze, unshaken. "I don't make enemies I can't afford to kill." A ripple moved through the crowd. Not a murmur, not an audible shift, just a presence, a creeping realization. This human was not reckless. He hadn't come to beg. He hadn't come to threaten. He had come because he already knew the answer. Karulth studied him, the stillness between, them stretching thinner and thinner, until it was a thread one word away from snapping. Then Karulth spoke. "What do you want?" The question was a test, a weight thrown onto the scales. The human's answer would decide whether he walked out alive. The human smiled, a slow, deliberate thing, like a man holding all the aces in a game no one else realized. "They were playing to fix your problem." The Vorak twins stiffened. A few enforcers took an unconscious step closer, hands hovering near weapons, and in return, Karulth's voice remained neutral, but something sharpened behind it. The human exhaled, as if amused. "In return," he said, "I take their place." The room froze. For a fraction of a second, even the ever-present hum of the casino seemed to falter. The words didn't make sense. Then, realization hit. He wasn't asking to work for the Syndicate. He wasn't offering a deal for survival. He was asking to replace the ones bleeding them dry, not as an ally, as the new power in the underworld. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Karulth's gaze. Then, motion, a blur of shadow from the right. One of the enforcers lunging, a plasma blade igniting mid-swing. The human moved, not with hesitation, not with panic, but with certainty. The enforcer's attack was a mistake, and in the next heartbeat, everyone in the room would know why. The plasma blade screamed through the air, fast, deadly. A Syndicate enforcer trained for speed and efficiency, no wasted movement, no hesitation. He had killed for less. But this wasn't less. The human was already gone. Not literally. He hadn't teleported, hadn't flickered out of existence like some void-born assassin. But in the space of a breath, he had shifted just enough to make the attack meaningless. A centimeter, maybe two. But it was everything. The plasma blade carved through empty air. The enforcer's balance faltered, weight overextended, a single fatal miscalculation. The human caught his wrist, a twist, a crack, a blur of movement so sharp it seemed unnatural, and then the enforcer's own blade was in the human's hand. Silence. No one breathed. The enforcer staggered backward, clutching his shattered wrist, eyes wide with something he hadn't expected to feel tonight. Fear. The human held the plasma blade casually now, like it was something he'd owned for years. Its violet glow painted his face in sharp relief. Don't. Just one word. A whisper in the tense quiet. And yet every single enforcer in the room stopped moving. The Vorak twins were motionless. Karulth Velos watched, his calculating gaze unreadable. The weight of the moment was crushing. The entire Syndicate was waiting for a reaction, for an order, but none came, because something was wrong. The human hadn't just dodged. He hadn't just disarmed. He had done it without effort, and that terrified them, because for all their power, for all their control, for all their stranglehold on the underworld, not a single one of them had seen it coming. The human let the plasma blade flicker out, tossed it to the floor with a casual flick of his wrist, as if it wasn't worth his time. "The Syndicate is bleeding," he said again, his voice measured, unhurried. "And you just proved why." Karulth exhaled slowly. The Vorak twins shifted uneasy. No one else in the room moved. They understood now. The human hadn't come to ask for anything. He had come to take it, and worse, he had already won. The plasma blade lay silent on the floor. No one picked it up. The enforcer who had drawn it cradled his wrist, eyes downcast, not in pain, but in something deeper: recognition, understanding, defeat. The syndicate was full of monsters, killers, smugglers, black market kings. But they understood one thing above all else: power, and power had just changed hands. The Vorak twins, usually unreadable behind their scaled, predatory exteriors, were stiff with something just shy of fear. Krulth Velos was still watching, unmoving, unreadable, but the moment had shifted. The control was no longer his. It belonged to the human, and everyone in the room knew it. Still, Krulth spoke. Not out of defiance, no, that would be foolish now, but because it was necessary. What is your name? For the first time, the human hesitated, not out of uncertainty, not out of weakness, but as if he were deciding which name to give. Then, with that same measured calm, he answered, "Call me Mercer." Krulth exhaled through his nose. The name meant nothing, but the weight behind it, the certainty in how it was spoken, meant everything. Mercer turned his gaze to the Vorak twins, to the enforcers, to the silent, watching crowd of syndicate elites. And then he made it real. The Orion Syndicate will fall within the next 10 cycles unless you change the game. His voice carried not just across the room, but into the foundations of the underworld itself. You can hold onto power, clawing at the edges as your empire rots from the inside out. A pause. Or you can let me fix it. Krulth's fingers flexed inside his long sleeves. No syndicate leader had ever handed over power, ever. It wasn't their way. It wasn't their nature. And yet the reality was undeniable. They were already losing, and Mercer had just proved he was already ahead of them. Krulth turned slightly, glancing at the Vorak twins. A silent command passed between them. The moment, stretched thin, balancing between tradition and survival. Then the Vorak twins bowed their heads, just barely, just enough. The room shifted. The decision had been made. The Orion Mafia, rulers of the Galactic Underworld, had just acknowledged the impossible. They had just accepted the human's offer. Mercer smiled, slow and deliberate. Good choice. The deal had been made, not spoken outright, not signed in blood or credits, but it was there, an understanding, sealed in the unspoken laws of the underworld. Mercer walked through the casino's high-stakes chamber with the weight of victory settling around him. Every step a declaration of the new reality. The Orion Syndicate didn't kneel. They didn't surrender. But tonight they had done something worse. They had acknowledged a new power. The Vorak twins remained by the table, their reptilian eyes flicking between each other, as if trying to grasp what had just happened. The enforcers, killers, extortionists, warlords in all but name, stood frozen at their posts, unsure if they had just witnessed the Syndicate's salvation or its end. And then there was Krulth Velos, still standing, still watching, but no longer in control. He was many things: a Veilkeeper, a shadow king of an empire built on secrets and debts, but above all, he was a survivor. He had been present when the last warlord had fallen, when the Syndicate had reshaped itself from the ashes of its own betrayals. He had lived long enough to know a simple truth: change came whether you accepted it or not. And the man called Mercer, he was change incarnate. For a long moment, Krulth simply studied him, as if searching for something beneath the surface. A flaw, a weakness, a way to kill him. But what he saw instead was something far more unsettling. There was no hesitation in Mercer, no arrogance, no desperation, just certainty. And that made him more dangerous than any warlord, assassin or rival faction that had ever tried to dismantle the Syndicate before. The realization settled over Krulth like a slow-building storm. Orion Syndicate, for all its power, for all its reach, had never seen him coming, and that was why Mercer had already won. Carulth's lips barely moved, his voice a whisper meant for no one but himself. Interesting. Then he stepped back, a fraction of an inch, a subtle shift, not retreating, but acknowledging. It was done. Mercer turned, walking toward the exit without another word, disappearing into the neon-lit corridors of the underworld. The Orion Syndicate still stood. The galaxy still turned, but nothing would ever be the same again, because the human had just rewritten the rules, and the galaxy's most feared criminal empire had just accepted them.